Welcome, my friends, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 13 today. We are finally going to be looking at the topic of Protestantism in France. So we've seen the spread of Protestantism into most of the major Western European countries, but we've not seen it in France. Today we're going to see the beginning of that. This is actually going to be a two-parter because it was a little long. So the spread of Protestantism in France, and this is going to be part one. To begin with, we need to look at the different royal policies at the time. At the dawn of the 16th century, France had achieved the greatest degree of national unity and centralization in all of Western Europe. We know from our studies so far that one of the big things that's going on at the same time as religious differences in different countries is that these countries are becoming very nationalistic, and their interests lie in being independent of one another, not just being somebody else's source of funds or armies or whatever it may be, but they're taking on strong national pride. Even in spite of that, there are still growing pains in those countries, but France is the one who has done it the best so far in almost every area. But there is one area where it has not happened, and that is religiously. Yet during the same time, France was bitterly divided between Catholics and Protestants. So with a national unity coming together, a centralization of policies through government and culture and all of the things that go with those things, you find that in spite of it, there's still a real big issue when it comes to religion. And the issue is that Protestantism has spread into France, which traditionally has been a very strong Catholic country, even so much that they actually housed the popes for some time. And now you've got Protestants coming in, and that's going to be a problem for a lot of people in France. At the beginning of the Reformation, France was ruled by Francis I. His religious policies were confusing, as he did not want Protestantism in France, but he did want it to spread in Germany because of the difficulties it caused Charles V. Charles V was the emperor, and Francis did not want to support him gaining more and more power. So while he didn't want Protestantism in France at all, he also wasn't going to go out completely against it because he encouraged it in Germany, because Germany was able to protect the Protestants. It was able to, through the government and the system of government there, take care of Martin Luther, protect him from the emperor. You can remember all of the different political things that are in play that kept Charles from being able to really stamp out Protestantism, which is what he wanted to do. So Francis looks over there and sees, okay, this is causing this guy a problem. It's dividing his attention, and it's helping to contribute to him not being able to gain any more power than he already has. So I'm gonna definitely support it in Germany. So I can't come out strongly against it in my own country and then turn right around and say, well, it's fine in Germany. So he kind of had to walk a tightrope, and he walked a fine line, and it really came down not to conviction, not to religious principles, but really to politics when it came to how he viewed Protestantism and Catholicism. And that tended to happen in these governments, and that's one of the big reasons that it absolutely was essential that religion get out of government control. At times, Protestants were persecuted in France as vigorously as they were in other Catholic countries. But at other times, as political expediency dictated, Francis allowed a measure of freedom to Protestants. So can you imagine living in that kind of an atmosphere where you didn't know from day to day or month to month or year to year whether or not you were going to be free to practice your religion, knowing that there were going to be times where you could, but also wondering in the back of your mind, when is the other shoe going to drop? Because it's just a matter of time until Francis decides, okay, it's not really helping me to be in big support of Protestants right now in Germany, so I'm going to persecute them in my country. So just a horrible way to live. You really didn't know what to expect. And this was harking back to those early church days with Roman emperors coming in and changing policies on the fly. They did different things like this where sometimes everything would be okay, and then at other times there was going to be persecution, and even the persecution itself would be severe or not so severe or somewhere in between. So, not a great way to live, but Francis didn't care. He was going to do what politically was beneficial to him, and it didn't really matter to him about the religious part. At this time, among the learned and nobility, Protestantism gained a great number of adherents. And you see that in all of these countries. Each one that we have discussed, it seems that those that are in the nobility, those that are in the upper society, part of society, and the learned are going to be the ones that are going to embrace Protestantism. And you may be wondering, why would that be? Because when it comes to Christianity, in most countries, if there's a new branch of it or if it's coming in for the first time, it tends to spread among the poor. Well, it makes sense because the reason that a lot of people were coming to the idea that there was something wrong with the Catholic Church was through education. At this time, humanism was very big, and the goal of humanism was to retain and rediscover and even expand on classical Greek literature. So they went back and they looked at it, and a great portion of what they were interested in would have been early religious writings. When they started reading the scripture in the original language, in the Greek, for the New Testament, Hebrew for the Old Testament, but they really focused more on the New. And they looked at documents from the early church days about how the church ran and what they believed. They found there was a lot of discrepancies with what the Catholic Church had been promoting. And so it makes a lot of sense that in this instance, the ones that started to really question the beliefs of the Catholic Church were those who were in the position to be able to learn about that information that wasn't out there. So the poorer people wouldn't have had access to it, and they would have been very scared to do anything to jeopardize their position in the church. So, because that was a one-way ticket to hell. So while looking at it on the surface, it might seem like that's not the usual pattern. It actually really makes sense in this case. But the periods of persecution led many Protestants into exile, including John Calvin. From exile, they watched with great interest the events taking place in France. So a lot of the Protestant leaders, even just members of the group, they got out of France. They decided, there are some countries next door that we can go to and probably be left in pretty much in peace. Or if nothing else, at least we'll know what the policies are and they're not going to be shifting so much. But over here in France, I don't know from one day to the next whether I'm going to walk out of my house and be able to go down to the church and have no problem, or be able to gather with other believers to worship, or if I'm going to be sent off and killed for that. So that was not a great way to live, and a lot of people left. And thankfully they did, because some of those people probably would have ended up dead. John Calvin, he's a tremendous influence in Christian theology. And what would have happened if he had stayed in France? Well, he might have been okay, but there's a possibility he wouldn't. I remember Zwingli is the guy that started the Protestant Reformation branch that became Reformed, the Reformed movement. And it's only because Zwingli got himself killed in a battle with the Catholics. He thought he needed to be out at the forefront leading the armies. He got himself killed and took himself out of the picture. Now, other guys came in and filled in the gap, and eventually John Calvin became the guy that took that overall leadership role. But if it had been that Zwingli had thought more like Calvin, then he may very well have lived, and history would be completely different now. So these guys, you can look at them and say, well, you ran away when times were at their worst. But on the other hand, why stick around and get yourself killed when you can move next door and kind of watch things from afar? So there's an argument to be made both ways. And for whatever it's worth, that's what a lot of these French folks decided to do, was let's just go on ahead and get out of Dodge, and then we can come back once things settle down. That brings us to Henry II. In the neighboring kingdom of Navarre, located between France and Spain, France's sister, Margaret, was married to the king. She was a scholarly woman and encouraged the reform movement. So you have Margaret. She is the sister of the king of France, Francis, and she's got a little kingdom called Navarre. It's located geographically between France and Spain. It obviously doesn't exist anymore, but she's over there. She got married to the king there, so that made her the queen. And she was one of these learned noble women, not really noble. She was royal, but she was a person who was scholarly, and she had learned some of this humanist teaching. She had gone back and looked at some of these documents that they had. And her conclusion was just like many of theirs, that there's something wrong with what's going on in the Catholic Church. And she got on board with the Reform movement, and she encouraged it there in Navarre. Margaret offered sanctuary to French exiles. She was one of the ones who said, hey, if you want to get out of France right now, I know my brother's acting crazy. Come on over here. We'll take you in and you'll be fine. So a lot of the people that fled France, they ended up over in Navarre. Francis I died in 1547. He was succeeded by his son Henry II. So here we've got Henry. Henry II continued his father's policies, but his opposition to Protestantism was more constant and cruel. So he didn't really do this playing both sides of the fence. He didn't really care so much about what was going on in Germany. He just didn't like Protestants. So he was a lot tougher on them than his father Francis had been, even though it wasn't a cakewalk dealing with Francis either. But now at least you know where you stand. This guy does not like Protestants, and he's going to be out to get them. Yet it was during his reign in 1555 that the first Protestant church was established in France. 4 years later, the first national synod gathered. So, just as we've said time and time again, persecution makes the church grow. It just happens everywhere. And once again, the Protestants, once they really get under persecution, they already were under it with Francis, but the heat gets dialed up a little bit and they just get bigger. They just grow more. And now they're establishing churches in France, and this is while they're being persecuted and told that you can't worship here. And they even have a national synod that gathered. So things are looking up for the Protestants, but they're still not going to be accepted yet. By this time, Protestant churches were scattered throughout the nation. The assembly approved a confession of faith and a discipline for the church. So they're making some real strides as they go. Shortly after that meeting, Henry II died of wounds received during a tournament. So he was in a little jousting tournament. Somebody went after him and they jousted, and the piece of the lance splintered, and the splinter somehow got past Henry's armor and went straight into his eye. And this was a total accident. It wasn't done on purpose. He died as a result of that. So 3 of his 4 sons would eventually inherit the throne: Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. In addition, his daughter Margaret would serve as queen following her brother's deaths. So he's got some kids that are going to rule after he's gone, and several of them get a shot. But the truth is, it was their mother, Catherine de' Medici, who sought to rule through her children. So she's going to use her kids to actually be kind of the power behind the throne, and she's going to instigate a lot of the stuff that's coming up between the Catholics and the Protestants. Well, let's look at Catherine de' Medici. Catherine's projects were hindered by the leaders of the House of Guise. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this Guise. I try to go look these words up if I'm not familiar with them and just listen online to different ways they're pronounced. And typically there'll be some variations, but I'll get a consensus. This one I did not. I got 3 different pronunciations for this thing. I got Guise, I got Gaze, and I got Geese. I have no idea which one's correct. So I'm going to just go with Guise. If it's wrong, that's fine. Just understand that there's a lot of people out there that's got it wrong if it's wrong. And I know none of these 3 may be right. Who knows? But anyway, just a note there. If you've heard this word before and it was pronounced differently, just realize you may very well be right, but I couldn't find out for sure. So we're going to go with Guise. Francis of Guise and his brother Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, had been the main advisors of Henry II. So they had a big influence on what was going on at France at the time. Well, Henry's gone now. Since Francis II, who succeeded Henry II, was uninterested in matters of state, Francis and Charles ruled in his name. So they're already in a very powerful position. Francis II doesn't care about any of this stuff. So he just says, you know what, guys? You're already here. You knew my father. And why don't you just run things? You run the show. Well, that's great for them, but it wasn't necessarily great for everybody else. The older nobility and the king's closest relatives resented the power of these 2 men. You can understand that. People that were used to having a say in things, people that as relatives were even in line for the throne, they can't get the throne because Francis is in it. But these two guys that have no relation to them are actually the ones in charge of everything. So not something people are going to tolerate for very long. They did not like it. Two of those relatives were Antoine de Bourbon and his brother Louis de Condé. Antoine married a daughter of Margaret of Navarre who had become a Calvinist. So these are relatives that are relatives of the royal line there in France, and they're not digging the guys being in and having a lot of say. They don't like it. And so they're going to have a little bit different take on things. Antoine and Louis accepted her religion, and thus Protestantism made headway among the highest nobility. So they go in with the daughter of Margaret of Navarre, and they're going to accept Calvinism. And that brings that religious belief to the very much to the forefront, because you've got people that are direct relatives of the king of France that are declared to be Protestants now. So that's going to change the scene a little bit. Since the House of Guise was staunchly Catholic, their struggle with the Bourbons soon took religious overtones. So they already had a struggle anyway. It wasn't that they were fighting over religion. They already had a fight, but that just didn't help things. So once again, religion gets piled in with everything else when it comes to power and nobility and royal succession and all of that stuff. The religious beliefs are not necessarily going to be along the lines of real belief, but more of what will help me politically. And it may be that they really believe it too, but that's almost an afterthought in this. So it's a crazy time in history and a crazy time in thinking about Christianity, because there's just so many things in play. So when all this is going on, a plot was discovered and it was called the Conspiracy of Amboise, whose goal was to separate the king from the Guises. So they want to try to get the king out of the influence of these brothers and get him back on their side. The Guises imprisoned several, including Louis de Condé, and they thought he was in on the conspiracy. He probably was. This caused grave misgivings among the nobility, because here you got this family that's not of the royal line, and they've got more power than a relative of the king. Here's a relative of the king who's been imprisoned by these people, and they're not liking this. They're not liking the chain of command. They're not liking the influence these guys have. It's too much. And so some of this new nobility crowd's getting a little bit nervous about this, and they're not liking it. Then Francis II died unexpectedly. He was kind of a sickly boy, so it may have been unexpected, but it really wasn't that big of a shock. Catherine de' Medici quickly intervened and took the title of regent for her 10-year-old son, Charles IX. So Charles IX's the next in line, but he's only 10. So you can't expect him to be able to know everything to do. So Catherine just says, you know what, I'll come on in. I'll be his regent. I'll kind of speak for him until he's of age. So she does, and that suits her fine, because she wants that kind of influence. Since she had been repeatedly thwarted by the Guises, she immediately had Condé freed and joined those seeking to limit the power of the Guises. So Catherine is not liking them either, so she gets on board, but she's going to be like some of these other wishy-washy ones and switch things around to whenever it suits her. This put Catherine on the same side as the Protestants. She freed those in prison. In 1562, Catherine issued the Edict of Saint Germain, which granted French Protestants freedom to practice their religion. So the ruler of France, basically, because she's the regent for her son, has said it's okay for French Protestants to practice their religion. That's a great thing, but they were prohibited from owning places of worship, gathering in synods without a prior permit, collecting funds, and supporting an army. So they definitely had some limitations, but at least they had this freedom now. And that's going to set the Protestants up well. But of course, there's going to be opposition to this. And the opposition comes in a pretty violent way. By these measures, Catherine hoped to gain the support of the French Protestants. But the guys refused to obey this edict, hoping to undermine Catherine's authority, so they weren't going to go along with it. Slightly more than 2 months after the proclamation of the edict, the Guise brothers gathered 200 armed noblemen, so they had them a little mini army. This group surrounded a stable in the small town of Vassy, where a group of Protestants were worshiping. So there's this area, this little small town. There's a stable. They're in their rights to worship there. They've not done anything wrong. They're doing what the law has told them that they could do, but then now here's the guys, and they've got an army together. They surround the stable, and then they attacked and slew as many of them as they could. Their object was to make that stable bloody, and they did. They killed a bunch of people. The massacre of Vassy resulted in the first of a long series of religious wars in France, and this goes on for years now. The two sides each raised armies and took the field. The Catholics won the majority of these battles, but their general was assassinated by a Protestant nobleman, so they never could quite get over the hump and knock out the Protestants. Exactly 1 year after the massacre of Vassy, the two sides agreed to a truce that granted the Protestants a measure of tolerance. But the peace would not last very long, as there were two other religious wars between 1567 and 1570. So this series of wars keeps going on. There'll be periods of peace. There's one here now. It looks like things are kind of settling down. And it's 1570. There's a peace treaty. It looks like things are going to be okay, but of course that's not going to be the case. And yet there was every reason that the Protestants have that there was a real hope that there could be peace. The peace of 1570 offered the promise of lasting peace. They thought, hey, this might be it. We may be okay. Plans were made for Catherine's daughter, Margaret, to marry the Protestant prince, Henry Bourbon. So Catherine's daughter, she's going to marry Henry. That's going to directly bring a big-time Protestant into the royal line. That is a big step for the Protestants. And yet, the Catholics are not going to be on board with this. All seemed to be going well for the Protestants, who after long struggles were now able to appear freely at court. So here they are. They've got members of their movement in the royal line now. They're by marriage in the royalty, and they don't have to hide their faces anymore. They can come out freely. Protestantism has been legalized. They can't do everything that they would like to do, but they at least have that measure of peace that they're hoping will last. But trouble was bubbling underneath. Obviously, nothing's ever going to stay good for very long. The new Duke of Guise, Henry, was convinced that the Protestant military leader Admiral Coligny had ordered Henry's father's death. This is the big-time military leader for the Protestants, and remember, Henry's father was killed. And he's thinking, okay, this leader must have ordered him dead. He must have put out a death sentence on my dad, and he's not going to get away with that. So he's coming for him. Henry was now ready for revenge. Catherine herself also began to fear the influence of the Protestant admiral who had won the king's trust. A plot developed to rid themselves of the admiral. So this Admiral Coligny had gotten in good with the king. Well, now Catherine is not liking Protestants so much, because here's this guy. She doesn't like the guys because they had a lot of influence with the king, and now this admiral that she's been backing, he's worming his way in with the king, and she's not going to like that. So here we go again. The belief systems, the convictions, however you want to put it, of these leaders will change with the wind. And you may be for the Protestants one day, and you just go right against them the next. And Catherine is going to go right along with this. It was working out good for her to support the Protestants for a while, but now she's getting nervous about it, and she decides she's going to flip a little bit. And they don't want this admiral around anymore. They're going to get rid of him. The main French Protestant leaders had come to Paris for the wedding of Henry Bourbon and the French king's sister Margaret. Everything seemed great. This is great. We're getting in now. Boys, our day's come. We're moving on up. And let's go celebrate this. We're going to support this. We love that we're going to have a member of our group married to the sister of the king. And so they come to be a part of the party, but they're not realizing that they're walking into a trap. But as Coligny was returning to his lodgings from the Louvre, someone shot at him from a building owned by the Guise family. Coligny lost one finger on his right hand, and his left arm was wounded, but the attempt on his life had failed. Coligny survived this, but there was some collateral damage. He lost a finger, and he got his left arm was wounded. and there was an attempt on his life made. So that's not going to go over very well with the Protestants. The Protestant leaders demanded justice. King Charles IX took the investigation seriously and uncovered evidence that the shot had been fired from an arquebus belonging to the Duke of Guise, and that the assassin had fled on a horse from Catherine's stables. Now, this is not great for these conspirators. So you've implicated the House of Guise now, and you also have Catherine in this, the horses from her stable. So these conspirators are thinking, uh-oh, we done messed up. We have made this attempt. We didn't kill the guy. And the Protestants are in a position now because of this marriage coming up that the king's willing to listen to him, and he's investigating. We don't want him to investigate, but he is. And he has discovered some important pieces of information. He now, through this investigation, there's implicated the House of Guise and his own mother, Catherine. As a result of all this, the king banned the Guise from court as the investigation continued. So, it's not looking good for these conspirators. Here is a big-time implication for the House of Guise, and even Charles' own mother, Catherine, is in on this now. So things seem to be looking good for the Protestants and bad for these conspirators, which would be on the Catholic side and the House of Guise. They may be going down, but we know the winds of history are very fickle, and they will change on a dime. And just when you think you've got things figured out, that's when it changes. So we're going to stop right there because of time, and we're going to jump back into this next week. So I hope you can join me for that. Thanks for taking time today. We will continue next week by looking at what happens next in this historical account and how that really makes a huge impact on the spread of Protestantism in France. So hope that you can join me for that time. Again, so thankful for you being here today. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.